welcome to it. It feels like Monday, but it's already Tuesday. Yes. What happens when we find the smoking gun, the proof that COVID-19 escaped from a Chinese lab, only to kill 3.5 million people so far, including 600,000 Americans? And what if we learn the Chinese government tried to cover up all of it for their own self-interest? How should the White House and the world respond? Every day, the Wuhan lab leak theory gains more traction. And today, there's a new report that British intelligence now deems the idea, quote, feasible. That's right. And a pair of European scientists, one British, one from Norway, claim that not only was COVID-19 manufactured in a lab, but also the Chinese government reverse engineered it to make it look like a natural virus, essentially to give themselves an alibi. And now Arkansas Republican Senator Tom Cotton, who was among the first lawmakers to suggest the lab leak theory, says if that's true, there needs to be consequences.
Only sense I have is a sense of relief that we're finally going to try to find the true origins of this virus. And I think all the evidence points towards those labs in Wuhan. And if we find out that's the origins of this virus, then China really needs to pay.
Former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb, he is the fly in the ointment. He claims this is not an isolated incident. Scott?
These kinds of lab leaks happen all the time, actually. Even here in the United States, we've had mishaps. And in China, the last 6 known outbreaks of SARS-1 have been out of labs, including the last known outbreak, which was a pretty extensive outbreak.
Good stuff. And an esteemed vaccine expert and doctor in Texas has a chilling prediction of what will happen if we don't hold China's feet to the fire.
And there's going to be COVID-26 and COVID-32 unless we fully understand the origins of COVID-19. And this is absolutely critical. We need to do an outbreak investigation.
But Chinese communist leaders are said to be outraged that the lab leak theory has even been suggested. And I'm no scientist, but I do have a little bit of common sense. The simplest explanation is usually correct. And every day, the leak theory looks and sounds more plausible and simpler. So what do we do about it if it turns out to be true? Let's get into it with tonight's party panel kicking off the week. We've got the Guy Benson Show radio host and townhall.com political editor, Guy Benson. Hello. Also, Reason Features editor, Peter Suderman, looking very dapper indeed, quite bookish, Democrat pollster, and Fox News contributor Jessica Tarlov here, rounding out the big three tonight. So, Guy, I will start with you. You know, there has not been a lot of talk about where we go from here if the lab leak theory is in fact true, but we have to move this story forward so this gruesome history doesn't repeat itself.
Yeah, I'm pretty cynical, Kennedy, about what's actually going to happen. I think the lab leak theory is at least viable, if not likely at this point. But you look at the tentacles that the Chinese Communist Party has economically throughout the world, and the bullying, frankly, that they're able to pull off because of that influence. There was an EU report a number of months ago that was critical of China regarding COVID-19, and the Chinese regime was able to bully and force, basically, the EU to soften the language and water it down in their own report. And they said, okay, and they did that. And we know that they are also trying to crack down on the Australian economy and really bring some pain to our allies and friends down under, because they have insisted rightly on a true investigation into what really happened. I don't know what the solution is going to be. Perhaps sanctions. I don't think we're going to go to war over this, but clearly something has to happen. And maybe here's one place to start. Maybe the entire international community, in the midst of this and the cover-up and the lying and 3.5 million dead and the crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong and the concentration camps in the western part of China, putting Uyghur minority Muslims in forced labor camps and sterilizing them, perhaps amid all of that, maybe we shouldn't collectively give the prestige of the Olympic Games to Beijing, which is scheduled to happen next year.
Yes, next year is supposed to be the Olympic Winter Games in China. And Peter, I agree with Guy. I think that is where you start. And I think they should be embarrassed. I think they should be held accountable. But, you know, obviously there are things that don't work. A hot war doesn't work. Sanctions typically also do not work. So what do you do?
I think that's a good question that we should be asking. And the first thing I would say is what you shouldn't do. And what we shouldn't do is shoot ourselves in the foot by with a response that is counterproductive, that harms Americans. And trade wars, for example, harm Americans. A lot of the kind of trade policy stuff that we end up seeing as suggested responses end up harming Americans. We don't need a giant military buildup that, even if it's not a full-fledged war, might put us closer to a war footing, right? Closer to war. And that sort of thing is dangerous. And I think that if we're thinking about a response here, and again, I say if because we still don't know, and this is actually something that is worth dwelling on just for a minute, is that it is, just as it was a mistake to say that there is absolutely no way that this thing came from a lab, it is now a mistake to say we know with certainty that it came from a lab. And I realize nobody here is saying that, but we need to be clear. We still don't know.
I don't know if we can know
the original
anything
mistake
with
was
certainty.
Right?
Yes, because you're dealing with an opaque communistic government who's not going to let anyone in. They say anyone outside of the scientific community is a spy, but they won't even let scientists in. They won't even give them access to the raw data that is so necessary to come to a conclusion. So they are making it very difficult because, you know, without an answer, there's no accountability. And that's essentially what they want. And, you know, they have tried several times to put the onus back on the United States and say, well, it probably leaked from a lab there. It's like, yeah, except for the part where we are the ones who paid so dearly in terms of COVID deaths and illness in proportion to our population. Jessica, how do you feel about sanctions?
I feel pretty good if we could find a way for them to be effective. And I do think that in the past, certainly I agree with Peter that a trade war is something that would cost Americans a lot. And I haven't seen it be that effective as a tool, especially against China versus another country that isn't as economically powerful, for instance, and doesn't have as many trade partners as China. So I was thinking, because I always go last on the panel, and I'm like, I gotta have something original to say, that maybe this is the moment to go to big corporations like Apple, like Nike, and to say, we understand about producing your products there, that you do get a deep discount, but can we unite for a little while, because we have lost so many millions of lives worldwide where they also sell their products, and here in the US, and can we work something out in terms of a carrot and a stick program with China where you say, you know, we're not bringing the NBA games there. And if the US government has to help the NBA out, has to help Nike out, whatever it is to send a message to China, coupled with not welcoming China to international organizations. These governments, these dictatorial governments, get such a high off of standing there next to world leaders of Western democracies and acting like they're one of us, and they aren't.
And
so you can't come to the UN, and you can't make our goods. And let's see where we go with that. And if I don't think they're going to open up their labs, but hopefully we can get further than what the WHO
I wish they would,
has
so
put
we would
forward
have
so far.
reason to kick them off the UN Security Council. You know, not that it really does much, but the fact that they have a veto on pretty much everything.
It's very prestigious.
And you're right. You know, there are companies that are so invested in China and gaining access to the largest market in the world, but to companies that are manufacturing goods, go to India, go to Vietnam. Go to all these other countries who would love to have your business and would love to build your factories. There are some nice beaches there, too. Meantime, the left-wing media not changing their tune about the origins of the virus. They're also changing their past. The Washington Post secretly changed a 15-month-old headline to make it look like they weren't so dismissive of the viral lab leak theory. Their original headline read, quote, Tom Cotton keeps repeating a coronavirus conspiracy theory that was already debunked. And that headline was quietly changed to, Tom Cotton keeps repeating a coronavirus fringe theory that scientists have disputed. Softening that a little bit, huh? Like their calluses getting scrubbed by a good manicurist. So how can we trust the media if they even lie in their own reporting? Guy?
You know, I'm still ruminating about Jessica's suggestion here, and I say this only partially jokingly, but if there was some sort of moment where we forced Nike, for example, to pick, I'm not sure they would pick us. I think they might pick China. And I worry about the NBA as well. In any case, my answer to your question on this topic about the media is very straightforward, very simple. Back to Occam's razor, which you talked about, Kennedy. It's really not more any complicated than this. Because there were bad people floating the lab leak theory, even though it was completely plausible and viable all along, because it was the rotten, nasty Republicans and the Trump administration and, you know, the out of favor crowd within the media. Their suggestion, no matter how reasonable, was just deemed out of hand to be wrong, wrong-headed, dangerous, contributing to hate, or whatever the sort of catchphrase or zeitgeist du jour was on the left. So the media got together informally and just declared it to be a debunked conspiracy theory based on nothing because the wrong people were saying it. And now the evidence is mounting, and they're like, oops, well, that looks silly. Let's go back and sort of try to clean up our own mess, because now more reputable people are saying the exact same thing based on not all that much new information.
They would like to be saying the other thing, but they can't because it's looking less and less true. And obviously very powerful people know where the virus originated. And it's not just the Washington Post, Peter. You have ABC News, Jonathan Karl, Chuck Todd and his ginger Fu Manchu. You've got Maggie Haberman at the New York Times, all saying, like, we hate Trump so much, we just didn't want to believe anything he said. But that is really, really sloppy reporting.
So I need to disclose my wife works at the Washington Post. I probably shouldn't comment on media decisions here, though. I think there were issues with the media coverage, but I actually think there's another issue here that is related, that goes back even further, which is the CDC and the federal health officials were often spreading what amounts to misinformation and disinformation. And they were saying stuff that was at best maybe a supposition, maybe something that somebody sort of that many people thought at the time, but they were saying this is absolutely certainly true. You had Dr. Fauci saying just tons of quite a few things over the course of the last year, where he has now admitted it wasn't even that he was sort of exaggerating the conventional wisdom. What he was doing was lying to people intentionally and knowingly in order to manipulate their behavior. And so I think the real problem goes back to the public health community, especially in the government, which views their job. They see it as sort of part of their business to lay down the line about what we can and can't know about viral disease and public health with a kind of certainty that at minimum, in the midst of a completely novel pandemic, the kind of thing that most of us have never experienced before, it's just not possible to have that level of certainty, and yet the CDC can't be honest with people. And so it leads in many cases to lots of misunderstandings, including it within the media.
But the virus is changing every day. That's why we change our story. Hot malarkey. They knew exactly what was going on. Fauci was just trying to cover his keister. Last word, Jesse.
Oh, my last word is that I hope that Joe Biden starts adding hot to malarkey, because that'll make everything more interesting when he's speaking. But on the Tom Cotton front and who was putting forward this theory, there was an element to it, especially with what Senator Cotton was saying, that was disturbing, which we haven't seen evidence of, which was that he also posited that China created this as a bioweapon. And there is no evidence of that thus far. So we have to be careful about where we go with this for sure. But definitely we've had, we've had people in big positions of power moving around on what the rules are, moving the goalposts, masking, unmasking, etc. But I think at the end of the day, we just did have too many people, and yes, people who are reporters shouldn't fall into this category, but the president did put forward that theory. He also said Xi Jinping was doing a great job managing COVID, and he also said that it wasn't airborne and it would be gone in a few weeks. And he knew that that wasn't true.
No, they all knew it. They're all a bunch of liars, especially Fauci. He knew they were doing this gain-of-function research and gave a bunch of money to that lab, knowing what they were conducting, because he had been told by U.S. diplomats and other scientists and researchers from the international community what was going on there. So shame on him, first and foremost. The party panel returns a little later coming up.